Assalamualaikum and hello. This video is about inhibition. Actually, there are two types of inhibition, which are reversible inhibitors and irreversible inhibition. In reversible inhibitor, there are three types, which is competitive inhibition, non-competitive inhibition, and uncompetitive inhibition. Now, let me start with competitive inhibition. For competitive inhibition, substrate and inhibitor compete to bind at active site of the enzyme. For competitive inhibition, Km increase but Vmax constant. This is Km is the affinity of enzyme to bind with the substrate. Km is decreased because the concentration of substrate must be decreased to to make sure that enzyme have more affinity to bind with the substrate than inhibitor. If the enzyme bind with the substrate, it will form enzyme substrate complex. Then will produce enzyme with the product. But if the enzyme bind with the inhibitor, it will form enzyme inhibitor complex with no product form. Next, let's we go to the non-competitive inhibition. For the non-competitive inhibition, enzyme bind with the substrate at the active site. Meanwhile, inhibitor bind at the allosteric site at the back of the active site of the enzyme. Enzyme bind with the substrate will produce enzyme substrate complex, then form enzyme with the product. For the enzyme that bind with the inhibitor will form enzyme inhibitor. Enzyme inhibitor can still bind with the substrate because, as I mentioned earlier, that inhibitor bind at the allosteric site, so substrate still can bind with the enzyme at the active site. Enzyme inhibitor bind with the substrate will form enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. At this reaction, enzyme substrate inhibitor complex can still become enzyme substrate by releasing inhibitor. And next, or else, enzyme substrate inhibitor, if they are moved forward, there are no product form. But if the enzyme substrate inhibitor release inhibitor and become enzyme substrate complex, they can produce enzyme and product. So for the non-competitive inhibition, Km is constant, but Vmax is decreased. This is because the equilibrium of this reaction is unchanged. So that's the reason why the Km still constant. For the Vmax become decreased because not all the enzyme substrate can produce product because some of them will be enzyme substrate complex, enzyme substrate inhibitor complex, so they cannot produce enzyme and product. Next is uncompetitive inhibition. For this, enzyme plus enzymes bind with the substrate and become enzyme substrate complex. The inhibitor can only bind at the enzyme substrate complex and become enzyme substrate inhibitor complex, and this will not form any product. But if the enzyme substrate inhibitor release inhibitor, they can move forward to produce enzyme plus product. For the uncompetitive inhibition, both of Km and Vmax become decreased. Next, for the last but not least is irreversible inhibition. For irreversible inhibition, the effect is permeable or untuk jangka masa yang panjang. So enzyme plus inhibitor will produce enzyme inhibitor complex, and they will form like this structure. The enzyme inhibitor, the inhibitor bind to the enzyme with the covalent bond. Okay, that's all for me for this video. Thank you.